Lamarck believed that organisms adapted through the use and disuse of a trait. Like the example of these giraffes, over time, these giraffes stretched their necks to gain their adaptation of a long neck, which is not true. On the other hand, Darwin believed that organisms best fit to live in an environment will live and pass on their traits, also known as natural selection, which is also known as survival of the fittest. The organisms that are best fit to the environment will live and be able to pass their traits on to the next generation. Unlike the short-necked giraffe who couldn't reach this palm tree and get food, this long-necked giraffe could easily get food, able to pass on their traits to the next generation. Natural selection, also known as survival of the fittest, is where organisms with a trait to help them live in an environment, those that live can pass on their traits to the next generation. Those that don't have the adaptation could die and cause a change in the population. That causes evolution. Genetic drift, on the other hand, is where a population changes due to a random event. There are two types of genetic drift. You have bottleneck effect, which is where a portion of a species dies off, leaving only the survivors, which could be around the equal amount or make it a genetic drift and have a dramatic change in the population. Or you could have, on the other hand, a founder effect, which is where a portion of the population moves off away from the original foundation. This shows antibiotics and how pesticides resistance can occur through natural selection. So antibiotics are only able to kill non-resistant bacteria. So bacteria that, like this white stuff or the blue stuff, will be able to die by the antibiotics because they're not resistant, unlike these red ones. But as these blue ones die off, leaving the red ones left, the red ones can repopulate after all the blue ones die off because they are the best fit to live in the environment. They can reproduce and grow the red population, also known as the resistant population. Microevolution is a large change in a population over a small period of time. So that's very persistent with these antibiotics simulation right here, as the bacteria changes very quickly. Microevolution is a change in allele. Microevolution is a change over time in allele frequencies in the population, and microevolution is the broad patterns of evolution over a long time span. Microevolution happens within a single population, while macroevolution happens with more than a single species. Despite their differences, evolution at both of these levels relies on the same established mechanisms of evolutionary change, mutation, and migration. We're going to end that recording. Divergent evolution is where two species split from a common ancestor adapt to their new environments. So they would have the same type of structures, but it would be in different forms because they're differently adapted to their environments. The change to create two different species from one common ancestor, because these divergent evolution can cause two different species, like with a whale and a shark. They have similar structures, but they two different environments, so they're not needed the same. Homologous structures are structures that look the same, but are different, have different functions between common ancestors. Along with embryology, shows how two animals are related to each other, similarities through their embryos to show how two different organisms have common ancestors. A vestigial structure are structures that are no longer used in certain organisms. So if two different species have the same organ, one may not need it due to the different environment, and the other may not and may need to use it. For example, whales with hip bones when they don't really need it. As you can see right here, this whale has a hip bone. But all three of these evidences show back to divergent evolution with common ancestors, just same type of structures, but with a different adaptation. Biological evidence is based on the organism's DNA. So, which, if they're two common ancestors, they would have similar DNA, even though they may look different. If DNA has similar strands of RNA, that means the species were the same at one point in time, or even if they don't look incredibly similar. Biochemical evidence is the most reliable evidence because biochemical evidence goes through DNA code, and similar DNA sequences show relationships between organisms. How similar the specific DNA sequences are means how long ago that their last common ancestor was. So if they have similar DNA strands, like as it shows here, that means they may have gotten split off a million years ago, maybe even closer, maybe 50,000. It just depends. Divergent evolution is shown by punctuated equilibrium, which is this graph right here, is common ancestors splitting into two different species drastically due to being in different environments. So as you may see, this purple butterfly may be in one environment, but as they kind of split off from each other, maybe through evolution, or most likely the bottleneck theory, not bottleneck, founder's theory, founder effect, one of these butterflies may get off into a new environment where they must become blue to survive, and one of the other ones may become red to survive. That is punctuated equilibrium. Gradualism is a minor change in an adaptation over a species over a long amount of time. This explains divergent evolution by showing two or more. Go. Convergent evolution is where different species with little or no genetic similarities have structures used to survive in one environment. So it shows here with like the dolphin and the fish, they don't have common ancestors, but they have streamlined bodies that help them swim through the ocean faster. These species have what are called analogous structures. These are common structural adaptations of unrelated species living in the same environment. So like I said earlier, with the streamlined bodies, it helps them move faster through the water just because that they come from two different common ancestors doesn't mean that they don't live in the same environment. That's why they have the streamlined bodies. For example, here's another example. The Arctic fox and the polar bear, they both have white fur, which is their analogous structure. They both live in the tundra. This color helps them blend in with their environment. They are both white for the same purpose, but they're not really related in any way. Different organisms in the same environment would have similar adaptations, though that were naturally selected over time. If you look at two similar organisms, like the crab and the shell here, or also the polar bear and the Arctic fox I talked about earlier, their DNA sequences would be different. That's how biochemical evolution shows how convergent evolution happens. They have similar analogous structures, but they would have totally different DNA sequences. So one would probably be like AT and all this sort of stuff, while the other one may be CG. Just convergent evolution is where two species different affect each other's evolution. Oh, my bad. Coevolution is where two species directly affect each other's evolution. When one organism adapts, it forces the other to adapt. For example, with a bird and a plant, the bird may take nectar out of the plant, so the bird can take the nectar and it would kill off the plants, but the plants with long stems where the birds could not stick their beaks down and get the nectar, they would be able to survive and pass on the trait. But then the birds with long stems, like right here with these hummingbirds with long stems, they would be able to get down into that longer, and they would just keep going longer and longer over time. So yeah, that's coevolution. Stop share. Endosymbiotic theory explains how nucleotic cells evolved. It started with a large think about it. Started with a large prokaryotic cell that took in small prokaryotic cells. That's how stuff like the chloroplast and the mitochondria came. So both of these cells benefited because the large cell could get the energy that came from the smaller cells, while the smaller cells get provided protection. So number two, this is a little bit of a long one. There are 6 kingdoms of life. These include plants, animals, protists, fungi, archaebacteria, and eubacteria. These are classified as prokaryotics and eukaryotics. Prokaryotics are single-cell organisms that have no membrane-bound organelles, so no nucleus, no mitochondria, and that type of stuff. Well, eukaryotes are the other way around, where they are multicellular and single-cellular, because protists are single-celled, where they do have membrane-bound organelles. Plants are eukaryotes with a cell wall, large central vacuole, and a chloroplast. Plants are autotrophs, meaning they make their own food from the sun through photosynthesis. Animals are eukaryotes with multiple cells and no cell wall. Large central vacuole have no large central vacuole nor any chloroplast. Fungi are single cell or multicelled with a cell wall made of chitin. Animals and fungi are both heterotrophs, meaning they consume food. Consume food from animals, or animals consume food and fungi decompose food. Protists are single-celled eukaryotes with either a cell wall made of chitin or of cellulose, which cellulose is the cell wall that is made from plants. Protists are both autotrophs and heterotrophs, meaning they can consume food or make their own food. Lastly, there are the prokaryotes. We have archaebacteria and eubacteria. Archaebacteria is a heterotroph that can withstand extreme conditions and climates. So like it could genuinely live in a hot spring or a volcano. While bacteria is a heterotroph that has a cell wall. They cannot live in extreme temperatures. You have bacteria in your body right now. Lastly, a cladogram is a diagram that depicts evolutionary relationships among groups. A cladogram consists of the organisms, lines, and nodes, which are these little split-offs right here, the A, B, C, D, and E. The nodes are where those lines cross. The lines represent time. So as the lines go up, that means there's more time between these evolutions. Nodes represents common ancestors, where these split off. So everyone in this thing would have a common ancestor in some way. But this would probably be a couple 100 million years ago. So we wouldn't even be closely, really at all, anywhere close to them. As you get closer up into the next, so that means protists and animals are really alike. They have a very common ancestor, just like protists and fungi and animals, my bad. At some point in the past, a population of common ancestors organisms were divided. Each node shows a split off of a common ancestor, and each line shows a body part or organ that consists. So let's say this is just cell at this A point. That means everything from here on has a cell. But let's say right here is single-celled, which means these two only have single-celled. But as you go up, it gets more cells from, like, let's say C. Let's say beyond C means multicellular. And as you go higher, it just more changes through evolution. Stop share and stop recording. Can you see